All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Elliot Marseille. I'm at the University of California, Berkeley, and I run a group called the Global Initiative for Psychedelic Science Economics. My background is in the economics of global health with a major focus on HIV/AIDS. And I was working in this field and taking a fewer contracts, kind of phasing out that part of my intensely active work life. When I had a serendipitous meeting with Rick Doblin at Burning Man, and he said he needed a health economist, and I said, "I'm your man." So since then, I am now focused full time on the economics of the emerging psychedelic therapies. And about 2 years ago, I started this group in Berkeley I mentioned, the Global Initiative for Psychedelic Science Economics. Oh, how did we get here? This is way too far. Let's get to the beginning. There we go. So there's been a conversation in the community for the last couple of years, maybe longer, that we need to move away from the very clinician-intensive regimens that MAPS originally pioneered for MDMA for PTSD that features 2 therapists and 1 client. I think they did this for very good reasons. I think it was right at the time to signal the commitment to safety. But I think we're at this point now, there's very active conversation and indeed some demonstrations of alternative models that include group therapy. And so the thinking has been, we got to move to group therapy because it'll save a lot of money. And that's kind of like arithmetically, that has to be true, right? I decided that we would crunch the numbers and find out how true that is. So how much money can be saved, and what are the implications for the clinician workforce and for the availability of the needed person power, as we scale up psychedelic therapies. So a little bit of the economic or policy context. In the US at least, and I think this is true in the UK and elsewhere, the current infrastructure for the delivery of behavioral health and mental health services is more or less overwhelmed by the demand for conventional therapies. And you can imagine that as psychedelic therapies become approved, that many millions more people will be in need of skilled clinician services for things like PTSD and depression, tobacco use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and there's a very long list. So that the current situation of sort of an overwhelming demand on the current system will become even worse. On the supply side, there's a proliferation of training programs, and that's good, but they have limited capacity, and there are a number of reasons to believe that the trained therapists who emerge from these programs aren't going to devote full time to psychedelic therapies. And there's various other disincentives to their working in this field. Also, there could be some legislative wild cards. I don't want to make too much of this because it's not law, but there was a move in the Massachusetts state legislature to cap the reimbursement for MDMA-assisted therapy at $5,000. And I don't want to make, as I say, I don't want to make too much of it. It hasn't been enacted. This is only one state. And one can only hope that this kind of political interference won't be common. But I'm not sanguine. This is going to be catnip to a certain type of politician. So all of this leads me to say 3 words: nullum gratuitum prandium. Now, I know there's a few people here who are a little rusty on their Latin. So for those 3 or 4 of you, let me offer this translation. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And this idea is at the heart of the worldview of us pointy-headed economists. All there are trade-offs, and the idea is to solve for the trade-off that's most optimal. That's all we got. But could it be that group therapy for psychedelic therapy is an exception to that? So it's possible that it could both ease ease supply constraints and lower costs. And if that was true, it's all benefits and no costs. We like that. So it's kind of a big deal. If this is true, this is potentially important. So our group approached Sunstone Therapies, which runs a clinical site. They've been doing psilocybin therapy for cancer patients. And also Chris Stauffer in Oregon at the Oregon Health Sciences University. Chris is running a trial for veterans suffering from PTSD. So it's an MDMA PTSD trial. And we gathered empirical information on clinician time and cost, the costs of screening and intake and other inputs. And we basically did a kind of green eye shades. There's nothing sophisticated about this. We sort of add up the costs and see what the cost per patient who completes the therapy is. And we compared their group therapy regimen with what the same regimen would be if there was only one patient in the session instead of multiple patients. So here's the Oregon trial, the MPG-1 trial. So it consists of 14 sessions, 4 pre-sessions, and 8 post-sessions, the usual 90 minutes each, and then 2 active psychedelic sessions of the usual 8 hours. And there's sort of 2 defining features here. Defining feature number 1 is that, that with the exception of 2 pre and post sessions and 1 of the active sessions, it's all group sessions with 6 clients. The active group session has twice as many therapists as the single client group sessions. So the ratio there is 4 clinicians to 6 clients. The Sunstone regimen is shorter. It's got a total of 5 sessions. And here, the distinguishing feature is something different, which is that the clinical supervisor is in a separate room. He's not in the room with the client, but is monitoring what's going on via TV and is ready to intervene as needed. So it's a way of spreading out that expertise over more clients. So you could say that's not exactly group therapy, and I won't argue the point, but it's groupish. So we looked at compensation rates for the clinical staff. That's very important. And we looked at the pharmacy costs, and I want to point out that we don't know, at least I don't know, what the price of MDMA is going to be. But $25 per milligram is kind of a middle road guess. So call it an informed guesstimate of where we are. Could well be higher, but let's just go with 25. At that rate, the 2 psychedelic sessions cost $6,250. Psilocybin is likely to be cheaper. So the 1 psilocybin session in the Sunstone regimen will cost about $1,500. So there's a lot of numbers here, but fear not. I'm only going to point out a few of them. You know, we slice and dice the data every which way because that's what we do. But the number I want to point out here, so this again is the MDMA for PTSD regimen. And the cost in the group version of the intervention, therapist costs are about $2,200. And on the individual version, it's about $4,300. So that gives you a sense of what the savings are. And of course, I'll say more about that in a little while. So if you put the costs in a pie chart, it pretty I mean, I did this because, frankly, I wanted to draw attention to the massive portion of the cost that is represented by the pharmaceuticals. So in the case of group therapy, it's about 2/3 of the cost is the MDMA itself. Most of the rest is therapists, about another 23%. On the individual side, the proportion of cost that is due to the MDMA decreases, not because the cost of the MDMA decreased, but just because it's more clinician intensive, and so there's more of the cost is dedicated to clinicians. So this is the same exercise, except looking at Sunstone's regimen for psilocybin for cancer patients suffering from depression. And here, on the group therapy version, we've got total clinician costs of about $1,500 on the group side, as compared with getting toward $2,400 on the individual side. Same pie charts. And as you can see, the intensity of the pharmacy portion of the cost is reduced here, but it's still quite substantial. So I wanted to look at how the savings in total variable cost change at various price points of the MDMA. So the absolute cost stays the same. That's that yellow line, because the cost of the price of the MDMA can be anything. It's not going to change the cost of the clinicians. That's why that's a straight line. But you can see that as we move from $5 to $30 per milligram for the MDMA, the relative reduction in total cost falls from about 34% down to about 17%. So the lower the cost of the MDMA, the greater the relative savings to the intervention as a whole. So now I wanted to add another variable, which is the number of clients treated in a group session. So Sunstone, the Oregon team used 6 clients in a group. So that's here. What each of those colored lines represent different price points for the MDMA. But what I want you to notice is that as you add more clients to the group, the incremental savings decreases. Again, this is basic arithmetic. So it could be that with a group of 6, you're capturing most of the benefit, but the group is still of a size that's manageable and safe. And I don't know. I'm not a clinician. I don't know that 6 is the final number, but it could be that that's kind of a sweet spot. And so our base case analysis, again, with MDMA at $25 a milligram, we see on the left axis there, on the left vertical axis there, we see percent savings of about 17%. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit more on clinician costs and times, because that's really where the action is when you go to group therapy. It's savings in clinician time and therefore costs. So you can see here that in the MPG-1 MDMA PTSD regimen, we have savings of about 36 hours of clinician time per client who completes the regimen. So that's a 52% reduction in client time and client costs. So we're talking about major savings here. But again, the overall reduction is about 20% because there's other factors in the overall cost besides the client time. So now Sunstone, same cut at the data here. We see that we have savings of about 9.4 hours of clinician time per client and a reduction in clinician costs of about 35% and an overall cost reduction of about 17.5%. So we've been sort of looking at the micro level, like cost per client served, and that's useful. But we also wanted to think about what the implications were for scaled up psychedelic services. So in another paper, we estimated that about 3.5 million adults in America would meet criteria, MAPS's criteria for MDMA treatment for PTSD. So 3.5 million. So one question we wanted to answer was, If each of those persons were to be treated once, how much longer would it take if it was via via individual therapy as opposed to group therapy? So the numbers I want to draw your attention to are on the top row here. Patients treated per full-time equivalent therapist. In the individual therapy, it's about 27 per year. And in using the group therapy model, about 56. So again, that's about a doubling of output per therapist. If there were an additional 5,000 full-time equivalent therapists, all they were doing is psychedelic therapy, it would take 26 years to treat everybody in that backlog of 3.5 million I mentioned. And it would take about 12 and a half years in the group therapy model. And the group therapy model would save about $6.7 billion. So another way to look at this, let's assume not everybody, not that entire 3.5 million would be served. Let's say half were. So this graph shows how many full-time equivalent clinicians, or let me put it the other way, how many years would be required to reach half of that backlog of cases at various levels of availability of clinicians. And obviously, the more clinicians, the less time, which you can see on this graph. But even out here at 10,000 new clinicians, that's a 3-year difference between the group and the individual model. And perhaps more realistically, if we're further to the left and there are fewer clinicians, the difference in the time that would take to reach any given target size of patients is much greater in the individual model and versus the group model. So we did the same exercise with estimating the prevalent caseload of people who are likely to meet criteria for psilocybin treatment for depression. And if you had 5,000 full-time dedicated therapists, it would take 7.7 years to reach each of those people with one treatment using Sunstone's regimen. And in the individual model, 5.3. So it saves 2.4 years and $1.7 billion. So there are limitations to this analysis. The most obvious one, maybe, is that we're just looking at cost. We're sort of neutral on whether people benefit as much in a group therapy context as an individual therapy context. I think there's good reason to believe that at least significant, important subpopulations will do better or be more comfortable. The uptake rates may be higher in group therapy settings for some population. I'm thinking particularly of veterans. But the truth is, as far as I know, there have been no head-to-head comparisons of the effectiveness of individual versus group models. So that's a limitation. Clearly, that's work that needs to be done. I think it's really important to confirm that the group models are at least as effective as the individual models. The projections I did of how much time it would take to serve any given population, extremely crude. I didn't take mortality rates into account and new incident cases. It's really just illustrative. It's kind of like order of magnitude, so you get a sense of what's at stake here. And finally, the overall reduction in variable cost. We can't know what it is because we don't know what the cost of the MDMA itself is or the psilocybin itself is. But the estimates of clinician costs are pretty good. I mean, that's empirical data we got from the two sites. So I conclude that group therapy reduces clinician time by about 52% in the MDMA PTSD intervention and about 32% in the psilocybin intervention. Group therapy, where it can be applied, can thus increase the effective availability of trained personnel by about 100%, and thus reduce the time required to reach any target population by about 50%. The effect on overall costs is more modest, 9.5% for MDMA PTSD and about 17.4% for psilocybin major depression. I would characterize that as significant, not trivial, but not, overwhelming. The real headline for this, and it was kind of, I didn't realize it until I got pretty far into the analysis. The important point is not the cost reduction. That's fine, it's there. The important point is the amplification of scarce, skilled person power as we scale up. And so again, something like an effective doubling seems very significant to me. Yeah, and so in that sense, group therapy has the potential to address two major problems that we're facing in scaling up psychedelic therapies. I want to thank my partners at Sunstone, Manish Agrawal, Paul Tommy, and Kim Roddy, and at OHSU, Christopher, and my longtime friend and colleague, James Kahn, who works with me at the Global Initiative for Psychedelic Science Economics. Thank you very much.